So that the technique question comes up all the time. So I did want to answer a couple of things that some of you guys have mentioned before, and maybe some tips and tricks about how to get through some of the most common programs and what to do there. So as always, I'm taking your questions. If you guys have any questions about Story, please, by all means, just chime that in, shout it out, whatever you got to do. Also, let's connect, because it's good not only connect with us, follow us, share, all that good stuff, yes, but connect with each other. This is all about networking, and we want to build that network. That's something that we talk about a lot. So it's not just career stuff or technique stuff. It's also about networking, making sure that that is really strong, and you have a network to lean on, people who are going to give you jobs, people who are going to call you up and say, hey, are you available? I heard about this thing, you should apply. That's the kind of network that you need to get going in the industry. So one thing that I've been dealing with lately is just talking about technique and setup and working through some of the programs. So we get a lot of questions, and one of the ones that came up was really, how do you set up your programs to get, to optimize your stuff, get your brushes, all that kind of good thing. So for people who are just starting out, they don't know how to do storyboards, maybe they've done illustration in the past and they haven't set it up for sequential art, a couple of tips I want to give there. So you can use a number of programs, and I usually list off a bunch, but it kind of starts with Photoshop. I think that's the most common and most accessible one that most people are looking at. Another good one is Procreate. So if you guys have your iPad or iPad Pro, you can sketch with that, and that's also a really good program. You don't really need much. It actually is pretty basic, and it doesn't have to be that fancy. In fact, pencil and paper work great. I love doing that. I still work on pencil and paper. I love to sketch out ideas and just keep it simple. And there's something really visceral and tangible about working with classic medium and markers and pens and Prisma pencils and all that. And I find that really cool. The digital tools come into play when you have to do production work, and you want to make sure that you're getting the most out of the time that you're spending there, because you can copy things, duplicate it, resize it, turn it around, twist it, and that all happens really, really fast. It's almost instant. And then you can also save it, export it, and send it right away to your client. Those are all really good things that happen with your digital tools. So I mentioned Photoshop. There's also Toon Boom Storyboard Pro, which is a really popular software package. And all of the software I'm going to mention right now, you can get student versions, you can get free trials for almost any one of these software packages. There's also Storyboarder, which is a storyboarding tool. Just do a web search for Storyboarder software, and I think you're gonna find what I'm talking about. And it's a pretty cool program. It's got some basic tools on there, but it's free, and you can start working right away. You can even take photos of your storyboards and turn those into actual thumbnails. So I mentioned Photoshop. You got Procreate. You got your Toon Boom Storyboard Pro. There's also TV Paint, which is a French animation program. Not many people in the US know about this program. They don't seem to use it that much. It's a little bit on the expensive side, and it's made for 2D animation. But you can also, my European guys know about this one. And, you can download a free trial and try it out. The cool thing about TV Paint that I really like is that the tools are really fast. They're really streamlined for drawing, and the feel of the drawing tools feel really good. So it feels as close to me, for me, as drawing on traditional medium like pencil and paper, right? Check that out. And then there's also the next one I want to mention is Autodesk Sketchbook. They recently made that free, which is a great benefit to artists altogether. And some of these have apps that you can download on your tablets and even on your smartphone. And that way you can do these things on the go. And that one is also free, and it's a really basic program, but the tools are also really, really good. So that's a really beneficial program. The cool thing about that is you can also set up a timeline. So that's another thing I want to mention. If you're doing your boards, you want to make sure you're using a program that at least has some way to do sequential art. Before Autodesk Sketchbook had a timeline, one of the methods of using that program would be to just do your images in either Photoshop format or a JPEG format, export it out when you're done, save out your file, and then in Bridge, Adobe Bridge, which is like an image file viewer, organization program from Adobe, you can start looking at it and you can flip your drawings. Essentially, you can go from in sequence. So if you label your drawings correctly and you have a nice naming convention that ends with 001, 002, 003, all the way on up, you number those things correctly. So in a program like Bridge, you could like with your arrow keys flip through your drawings and see how the sequence was working out. So it's almost like flipping, right, in your traditional ways with like animation paper. In fact, here I'll show you. Remember back in the day when we used to work on 2D animation paper with your holes, right? These are like your pegboards and stuff. So you take your animation paper and you literally like flip like a flip book, and you do this, and that's the way you would work, right? And I would do this as a story artist. I would actually get a template on my animation paper, draw on this, and I would sit there, either top peg or bottom peg, but you kind of roll your drawings back and forth and see the change from one drawing to the next. And that's essentially what you want to be doing in a digital program. The reason is you're going to want to maintain the volumes of the characters in your scenes. You're going to also want to maintain you can almost look, it almost looks like you're cutting from one shot to the next. And that's why you want to make sure that you're using a sequential program, or at least being able to flip with your arrow keys back and forth from one drawing to the next. So that was the most basic way of doing it in Bridge. Now most programs have a timeline, and this is a really good tendency that I see in these programs, because we're making sequential art and it has to be timed out. And sometimes, in most of these programs, you can actually click play, and you can go through the sequence, one by one, or see the images one by one. You can also export them as a movie file, which is really helpful. So a program like Toon Boom Storyboard Pro lets you actually create an animatic as you're drawing. And hopefully you guys know what the animatic is. It's a story reel that's timed out, that has the proper pacing of each panel that you put into your storyboard sequence. And that way you can see the flow. So if you're working with dialogue, you can put your dialogue right in there. You can even just imagine how long to hold a sequence. If you have a pan, you can see the pan in real time, and you could create those things as you're working, which is a really great benefit for a program like Toon Boom. And again, you can export that and you can send that to your editors, or you can put that in something like Adobe Premiere and start creating a more elaborate animatic if you have to. Okay, so those are the programs that I think, just in general, that you can use, and things you need as a basic setup. So most all of these programs have options for brushes or pencils or some kind of drawing tool that you're going to be using. And the one thing that I do with any program that I'm using, I usually take like a number of hours, if not a full day, just to get set up. So if I'm new to the program, because I remember when I first picked up Storyboard Pro from Toon Boom, there's all these buttons and templates and arrangements of the workspace that you have to go through. So I go through that, some tutorials and that kind of thing, but I set up my windows in the way that I think is most efficient for my drawing setup. And I pick my brushes that I want, do some test drawings. I'll export things to make sure it's right. I'll kind of play around and click all the buttons to make sure I can do what I want to do. But really what it comes down to, there's only 1, 2, and 3 brushes that I use that are maybe a thin one, a thicker one, and a real bold one that like a fill-in shape. Then these are usually around 3 or 4 points, pixel size, right? And after that, the other thing that I'll set up is a palette of just basic grayscale colors. So I usually have maybe 5, at the most maybe 8 grayscale tones. So from black to white, that's 2 of them. You probably one in the middle, a middle tone gray, and then 2 in the middle of those. So that's 5 or so. And so yeah, you get a dark gray, a middle tone gray, a lighter gray, and then a white. And that's all I really use as a black and white scale. And then I might throw in a couple colors, like a red, a bold dark red, if I want to highlight some arrows or put some notes on the frame. I'll do a non-photo blue, and then maybe I'll put a yellow or something like that. Just extra supplementary colors. I'm not actually working in a full color spectrum when I'm doing my storyboards, because I keep it very, very simple and mostly black and white. So you want to have a way to sketch out your drawings in just black and white line art, and then maybe on another layer you can start filling in some tones. And most programs you can do that. So you also want to have a program that can do things in layers, right? That's also really, really important. So get the setup, get your basic brushes, and make sure you have a way of working through your layers and also working in the timeline. Once you have that, forget about the tools and worry about your storytelling. Make sure your sequence is the most important thing, and that's when you can actually start thinking about how to develop these characters and the scenes and the shots and all that really good stuff. And you can get the tools and the technique out of the way. So really, it doesn't take much. And if you've worked in Photoshop for a number of years, you can usually apply those skills to any of the other programs. So there's like, you know where your undo command is, you know where your layers menu is, and then you can add a couple of fancy brushes on there. And in fact, I've seen people who have some brush kits that you can buy for relatively affordable cost, and you can download that stuff and bring that into Photoshop. In fact, there's a lot of people who can share that for you. And I think bouncing around Storyboard Art in some of the forums, there were some brushes that people have made, and pencil brushes or charcoal brushes to mimic certain like techniques. Certainly with things like Procreate, you can do a lot when it comes to technique and stuff. So that's all really, really good. So yeah, efficiency in your setup with your technique is really important. All right, so let me give a shout out to people. Hey, all right, this is great to see everybody on here. Cool. Now, the other thing that just to mention is that if you miss these live chats, we're posting this to YouTube, and then we're also reposting that on the other social media. So if you don't catch us on Facebook or Instagram, you can catch us afterwards and see the recording. And then ask your questions there. So if we miss something, by all means, go in, type your question, and we'll get to you. And yeah, so I want to answer a couple questions. And if you have anything else, please show that, type that in there and share it with the group. And we'll tackle that in this chat. Cool. All right, and let me say hi to the people on Facebook too. All right, Rodney, good to see you guys. Hey, Tim. Hey, Saddam. How are you? Hey, cool. Tim here put a note. He said he downloaded our Photoshop actions from Storyboard Art. I found them really helpful. So I shared with guys in our Storyboard Art group how I set up my basic setup in Photoshop, and I included my actions and I included my brushes there, I think. And yeah, you can download that. And I think we're going to do we have a post up on our Storyboard Art page, and we're going to do a special message for people who missed that. At least you can see what I'm working on. A couple of people have mentioned that they like the way that I set it up, so that's really nice. I'm glad it was helpful for some people. And by all means, there's the way I do it is not the way you have to do it or you should do it. It's no industry standard. It doesn't matter. What I want is at least that'll give you a start, and then you can adapt it for your own thing. So it's great, Tim, that you were able to use some of the actions. So because I have a couple of action menus, you can set up like these macro keys, which are kind of like shortcut or repetitive things that you do in the program. You can set it up so it'll kind of like do it on command if there's a multiple set of actions that you do inside of Photoshop. So I have one that will, if you're drawing on a layer, if you click a button, what it does is it turns that layer like half the opacity, and then it adds a new layer on top of that. So right away you can start cleaning up the layer that was below it on a separate layer, and it's all just a button that you click. And so that's a really good way to make things move and keep it fast and efficient. That's one of the things that when I'm talking about efficiency, I get in there and I make sure that kind of thing is set up for me. It's kind of stressful when you have to do that on the job. So it's like you have you have a certain time limit. You might be new to a job or something. You have to go. So that's where you want to understand and know how to use these programs. So if you have your presets or the brushes that you use, just make a copy of that, and you can upload that into any kind of work environment that you're in. Usually if you're using Photoshop or Toon Boom, those brushes and workspace settings can be exported out and saved, so that in your new environment you can just import that and you're ready to go right away. Cool. All right, let's get to some of the questions here. Alyana Timbal, let me ask you, or let's see, she's asking a question here. For a series, do you personally prefer a continuity heavy story or an episodic repeat, i.e. that episodes that don't need continuity? That's a good question. So I think, let me just sum this up, is that are you talking about a story that is a one-off story in an episodic series that doesn't necessarily connect with the overarching story, the major story of that episode, right? Think of Game of Thrones and like how each episode kind of builds on the last one, and you're leading up to a big giant climax, versus kind of I don't know, what they do in Star Trek sometimes, where they go off on a separate mission, and that episode just has to deal with that mission. Which one do I prefer? I kind of like both. The cool thing about doing a one-off kind of episode is that one episode is a story in and of itself, and that you can have an arc and a kind of a three-act structure within that one story. And it's kind of nice to just, do your best and really make something cool and innovative there. I love series like, this is going a little bit back, but like Samurai Champloo, if you guys seen that series, or Cowboy Bebop. I really loved that Cowboy Bebop series back in the day, because it had both. It had like this arcing story that went throughout the whole series, and then every once in a while they'd have like a branching episode here and there. So what do I prefer to work on? Really, I don't have any preference. I am a fan though of pushing the overall arcing story. So if that one-off story that you're going to be working on is a complete deviation, and it's like almost like a filler thing where it doesn't necessarily relate to the bigger arcing story, that I feel like is less exciting for me. I'd rather have something maybe that fulfills both, that you can have like a side story that takes place with one character, but then it kind of feeds into the bigger overarching series climax that you're going to be working on too. So we did a lot of that in Rebels and Clone Wars, and then also in the latest series that I worked on, which was Star Wars Resistance. There's some good stuff there. Hey, Chad, what's happening, baby? How are you? Good to see you. Okay. Next one, Pierce. Let me answer your question here. Any films you recommend to watch when boarding? Thrillers, suspense, or horror? That's a good question. So thrillers. Suspense, you can go to the classics like Hitchcock. In fact, if you're doing anything suspense, you should go to Hitchcock, because he's like one of the most well-known guys who can set up suspense really well. Horror, there's a lot of really great horror, and there's one that we're reviewing currently that Wahab, one of our contributors, is talking about, which is just Ridley Scott's Alien. That's a really awesome space horror genre. Let me think of some other cool suspense ones that come to mind. There's certain things like thrillers. I love kind of the whodunit kind of stories where you have to figure out kind of mystery. Things like, I don't know, what comes to mind? And also drama. So, I mean, Children of Men was on my mind recently, because I thought that was a really cool film. It was really shot really well. But I think really what you want to do is kind of make a list of the genre films that you like. So there's a big difference between John Carpenter's horror films and Stanley Kubrick kind of horror movies, like The Shining, for example. And so that one, certainly the Kubrick movies, I think, are great for suspense. The Shining is fantastic. That's one of my favorite films. And so that I would definitely watch. But you can't go wrong with these heavyweight directors and these guys. Like Ridley Scott, I just mentioned a bunch of them, right? Ridley Scott, Hitchcock, Kubrick, John Carpenter, like all of these guys are really, really cool. I even like some of the modern stuff, like I think it's Jordan Peele with what's that film? Get Out, I think it's called. That was a really cool, kind of a very simple but really effective horror film. So there's plenty there to work on. Yeah. All right, let me get to an Instagram question. Awesome. This is great that you guys have a lot to say. Okay, so from let's see, Murillo 2010. Hey Sergio, how you doing? What do you think is going to happen to the animation industry after the coronavirus pandemic? This is a fantastic question. Do you think that it's going to get harder for freelance artists to get work? Okay, let me prep this question by a couple of positive notes. So California recently put a bill out there saying that it kind of made it more difficult and the language a little cloudy when it came to freelancers. Like companies had to specifically hire freelancers full time, and it was kind of to crack down on the whole Uber like part-time workers. But the wording was really vague, and it also affected freelancers. The one good thing I think about coronavirus is that I think if anything, some of those things would probably get shot down now, and hopefully there's going to be enough of a of a backlash and people saying like, come on, man, we got to work remotely, and so this freelance thing, it just doesn't apply anymore. So I think that I'm not a fan of any time like these rules and regulations come in for freelancers and trying to limit industry, because it usually ends up hurting than actually helping. So that's one good thing that's going to come out of this, is that the fact that that remote people, freelancers, and everything are actually going to be more in demand because of this coronavirus pandemic that we're doing. So, and to just repeat your question here, do you think that it's going to get harder for freelance artists to get work? My prediction here, I have no idea, but my prediction is actually I think it's going to be easier for freelance artists to get work. So if you're in a remote location and you're talented and you have a good portfolio, I think studios, because of this whole thing that's going down right now, they're probably going to be more open to working with you at a distance than they probably were before, because they had the choice of getting people that were local and coming into the studio. Now that, because of what's happened, it's been really disruptive to the industry. And so, people can't actually go to work, and they're forced to work from their home studios. And I know a bunch of people who are doing that just now. And the tools are there. You can coordinate, phone calls, emails, really strong internet connection. You can do it. It's possible to do that. And as far as like longer term, what's going to happen to the animation industry in general, we're going to have some good news out of this, and we're probably going to have some bad news. The good news would be that maybe some new productions would start up that are distributed, and that the cost would come down because of it, because you don't need a big brick and mortar place and to pay a lot of overhead. You can work with talented people in a distributed format, and I think that's going to kind of revolutionize the trend that was already started in doing animation stuff, right? Kind of the bad news is that maybe some projects that were risky or that didn't have full funding, they might get cut, because everybody's going to start to squeeze after this pandemic. I mean, I think the economy, it's obvious that things are taking a hit. A lot of people filed for unemployment. People are out of work right now. Restaurants are not working at 100%. Everybody's staying home. So there's an impact, there's a consequence to everything that's going on. The cool thing is, and this is also to leave this on a positive note, is that usually entertainment in the entertainment industry does really well in times of economic downturns, right? So think back in the Great Depression, the film industry was actually really hot back then. Theater was still going strong. And look what's happening now. Gaming and streaming are blowing up beyond belief. Like, that's one thing where Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon, and anybody who's a gamer out there is probably, that's all they're doing right now, is playing video games. And video games is narrative storytelling. They need artists, and it's a really big industry that we can participate in as visual storytellers. So that's something that we're gonna hopefully benefit from. So I'm a positive guy with this. I feel like we can come out of this as an industry stronger if we stick together, and you guys keep working at it. That's why we have the stuff and the resources on Storyboard Art, so you don't start slacking off, and you build up your skills and you use the time wisely in this a little bit of a blip that we're having right now. All right, cool. All right, let me take a couple more questions. Hey, Chad. All right, great, buddy. Thanks for asking a question. So Chad asks, this was asked a few days ago in the Visual Storytellers chat. Is the use of pencil and brush a matter of preference, or is there a preferred line look for industry standard? Yeah, actually, I think I saw that question too. So this is a technical question here, because I remember what it was referring to is kind of like bitmap versus vector art. And if you guys know anything about that, vectors are they're kind of computer generated line work that have like points, essentially, that create very smooth artwork, and it's not resolution dependent. So you don't have to worry about resolution if you're using vector artwork. So a program like Toon Boom will use vectors. And also, speaking of Toon Boom, you can also do bitmaps, which is basically pixels. And then when you lay down a stroke, it's locked in there, and it is resolution dependent. So if you blow it up, it's going to look fuzzy. Whereas with vector line work, it regenerates and it creates a new smooth line at whatever resolution that you're using. So I think what happens, there's no preference, there's no industry standard. It's more like just a trend, right? It's more like what artists are using today. And you can follow that or not. I almost recommend that you figure out what brushes and what techniques work for you, and that you just go with that and not necessarily copy what other people are doing. Because if you look at what people are like at Pixar or DreamWorks or Disney or any of these big studios do, their artwork looks very similar when it comes to the story reels. And that's probably designed that way because people are using the same pipelines, they're using the same software and the same series of tones and the character designs and everything. So it all ends up kind of looking very homogenous in the story team. Regardless, though, what you can do is just if you have your specific brushes that you use, it'll create a unique look. But there's no real industry standard. The key there is to just make sure you're focusing on story. If your storyboards are clear, if your character poses are really nice and the silhouettes are good and the clarity is there in your image, nobody's going to really care what technique you're using, right? So you want to make sure you have depth and things are popping out. You have good contrast, all of the things that come with art skills. That's what you want to make sure is really tight. Everything else on top of that, as far as technique, to me is secondary. So I say one of the things I say is don't cover up substance with technique, right? What that means is make sure the substance, the storytelling, the meat of what you're trying to do, the communication of the idea is really strong. And any kind of rendering or cross-hatching or whatever it is that you put on top of that is just icing on top of that cake. Okay. Yeah, great question. All right. Yeah, Samurai Champloo. All right, Mark, what's happening? All right, good. I'm glad you like some of my references in your Cowboy Bebop and Samurai Champloo. Hey, Murilo has a follow-up question here. Do you think storyboard artists living outside of the U.S. and Canada should work on the portfolios for animation, TV series, or features? Well, isn't that kind of a loaded question? Let me see. Should work on the portfolio for animation, TV series, or features? Well, I kind of know what you're getting at. I'm just saying, like, should we, or do you have to? It's all up to you what you want to focus on. But okay, let's look at the industry trends right now. Streaming is really big. Episodic TV series, both live action and even animation, are really popular. A lot of anime is coming over to the United States, and they've had like a tradition in Japan of doing a lot of episodic stuff for a long time. That's coming over. People are really enjoying that, and that's getting really popular. So features now are usually take a lot longer, and the end product is only about 2 hours. If you have an episodic show, that could go on for a number of seasons. That's many multiple hours of content that you create. So which one is better? It's really up to you. I think you should probably have both. I'm seeing probably that episodic TV and streaming and kind of these series type shows are getting more and more popular. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's going to really take over and be a trend right now. So we have to kind of predict what's going to happen in the future. I don't think feature animation or feature films are going to go away anytime soon. The long format storytelling is still going to be there in one aspect or another, right? You can do, even like Game of Thrones had long format episodes. They're sometimes hour longs or hour and a half, and that was kind of cool to see. So I don't think that's going away, even though that was built in a bigger overarching episodic series. Okay, there's always going to be a demand for that. So what you should focus on really is having a portfolio that can show off examples of both, and that whenever you apply to the studios that are looking to hire people, that you make sure you're tailoring your focus to them. Now, whether you're in the U.S. or Canada or anywhere in the world, I think that is that's really a general thing. It's not location specific, right? And this goes to show what I was talking about earlier, is that if you can set yourself up well as a freelancer, you might be able to get a job working from where you live and actually get on a production and work remotely like that. I think those opportunities are going to start opening up a little bit more, right? Cool. Zach Chan, this is another great question from Facebook here. Is Disney in trouble? Do story artists have to have face-to-face with the director, meaning live in LA or New York? Is Disney in trouble? Man, I doubt it. When I was working at Lucasfilm, which is owned by Disney, they they would send out emails about their corporate earnings and their yearly earnings, and they would break records almost every year. So they had many multiple record-breaking profitable years leading up to any kind of economic crisis that we might be going into, or any pandemic or any blip that we have right now. So Disney, I doubt, is in trouble. They also own a lot of studios and assets. So anytime you have an economic downturn, companies will normally, this is a natural progression of things. They'll start to cut the fat, okay? And this is something that you should know about. And it's not something like, oh man, these big bad companies, they're evil and they're trying to cut jobs. This is the reality. So you have to understand what's going on in order to save your own ass, right? So if you're part of the fat, if you're part of a team that's like bloated, that is spending a bunch of money, and it's a show that's not even that popular, what do you think is going to happen, right? You're going to get cut. So make sure you know where you stand. This is why you have to have kind of a bigger perspective of things. So is Disney in trouble? No, I don't think so. I think they're going to be totally fine. They have, as far as I know, I think that company has a lot of cash. Like the cruise ship industry, they have like a travel division. The theme parks might take a dive because that not many people are going to want to go to the theme parks after this Corona thing, or it's going to slowly come back. And who knows what the travel industry is going to happen. But their film industries, even though things might got derailed, I think they're going to come back on board. And like I said, I think the entertainment division is going to pick up again. That's the natural way these things ebb and flow. So yes, people might get out of they might be out of a job if you work at the cruise ship, right? Unfortunately, that could be just a reality that we're dealing with. But then other jobs and other opportunities will come up. So that's what you have to do. As far as us specifically as artists, you got to see that stuff coming, right? Every time I've been on a production, I could kind of smell when the production was going to get cut. And I've been laid off a bunch of times, in fact. And thankfully, it wasn't because I got fired, but it was just the project got cut. And it was because, things were bloated, we, over budget, we didn't make deadlines, many things happened. And then bam, the project ends right there. So you kind of build up a sixth sense to that kind of thing. And, it happens all the time. It's just the way that the companies work. Anyway, so I'll move on to the next part of your question, but that was a good question to ask. Okay, so do storyboard artists have to have face-to-face time with the director, meaning live in LA or New York? That's a preference, and it's probably always going to be the preference that you're there, right there with the director and the person. You have a story team that you're working with. This is the one thing that I think is still great about being a story artist, is that the story teams are not outsourced yet. Regardless, though, I know many productions, these are the ones that I'm trying to think of the company, is like the ones that did Despicable Me and the Minions. And those were actually, I know we're working on a distributed format. Even the story teams were distributed. So some of the guys were in-house and some of the guys were freelance. So that's an interesting setup. So you don't always have to live in New York or LA. In fact, you can probably, if you set up your network really well, you might be able to make those contacts and then live wherever you can, which is hopefully the cost of living is much cheaper than LA or New York, which are some really expensive places to live. So so hopefully that trend will continue. All right, let me go to Instagram again, and we'll take a few more questions before we have to bounce out here. So the other thing, I mentioned this before, but if we don't get to your questions, go ahead and message us, and we'll see what we can do to answer it. Right? Let me answer Jason's question here. So Jason Confessor asks, how long does it take you to draw a single frame? And this is actually a very common question when it comes to storyboards. How long do you draw a panel? The real answer to this is as long as you want. The answer is basically it depends on the project that you're working on. And I think I mentioned some of this before, but one of the questions that you should ask when you go into work on a job is what kind of finished level they're looking for. So you ask the client, do you want how tight of a polish do you want on your storyboards? So and then you would show them examples of something really fully rendered that you have, something that's a little sketchier, maybe like your kind of animation style storyboards, which have just basic line work and some tones, and maybe you want to show them some thumbnails, and you give them a range, and you say, okay, for this drawing it took me it took me an hour. For this drawing it took me 2 hours. For this drawing it took me 4 hours, and for this super awesome tightly rendered concept piece it took me a full 8-hour day to get it done, one image. So so there's a big range there. Now and so depending on what production you're working on, if you're doing pitch boards or beat boards or concept boards for a film, you could spend a long time rendering out one image. And certainly you want to build up your speed so you can get those really tight, nice look of your images as fast as possible. But doing something with tight perspective and cleaning up your line work and stuff, it always takes time, no matter what program you're using or how fast you are. So what is more common in animation boards or continuity boards for an animatic reel is doing a simplified version of those storyboard panels where on average a single frame could take, I don't know, maybe, there's still a range there too, because you can really turn on your afterburners and knock something out in 5 minutes, or it could take 1 hour to do a panel, maybe even 2 if you have like a big long pan. So there's a range to that. On average, there's kind of like however many boards you can do in a day. So my personal average when I'm working in animation or episodic work is probably about 40 to 60 storyboard panels a day, and that's pretty fast. That's actually a really fast pace, and I'm not trying to brag. That's me hustling, like really sacrificing some of my line work and simplifying as much as I can just to get that kind of quota. And if you actually bring that down a little bit, you can probably get a little more quality into your images. So you sacrifice quality for time sometimes. But that's where you have to learn how to simplify. So that's kind of a loaded question. All right. Cool. All right. Let me get to Joe. Hey, Joe, what's up, buddy? Good to see you. Let me get to your question. And there's no such thing as a silly question. Okay. So just got followed by somebody I really respect in the industry. All right. Good for you. I want to reach out. Any advice so I don't sound like a fanboy? Everybody loves a compliment every now and again, right? I would simply muster up the courage. And so let me repeat the question in case you guys missed that. So this badass artist here, Joe, has just been followed by somebody who he really admires and maybe likes, right? Another artist, maybe somebody that he's been following for a while, but this guy actually gave him a follow back, right? So he wants to reach out and maybe thank that person or contact them in some way to make a connection, right? The idea here is that you do make a connection and build up your network. So what would you actually do? Now, there's a ton of methods to do this. If you're asking me, I would personally just draft a really short sentence, really short, what I'm trying to say here, a really short message with a few sentences, and that would say something like, hey, thank you for the follow. I really love your work, and be specific. I love this particular piece that you posted here. You might even like put a copy of that in your message in some of these programs you do, like Instagram and whatever. Or you could like reference a movie that they worked on, or a project that they did, or some illustration that the reason that you like them. And it's not necessarily coming off of like a fanboy. You could just say that you admire their work and that you have a specific thing that you liked, so it shows them you're not just like generalizing, because I'm sure these people, if you're well known or something, you might get a lot of these kinds of messages. And then you say something specific, maybe give one specific ask, right, to these guys, and make it really short and quick, something related to them, right? Keep it about them for now. So you would say something like, okay, I really love this illustration that you posted here. What was your inspiration for that piece? You keep it open-ended like that. And what you're hoping for is that this person will take your compliment, enjoy the message, and give you a response. And say something like, oh, wow, thank you. And yes, the technique I used here was this, or the reference material that I used was this, or I was thinking of, a trip that I took, and that's where the inspiration came. So then you start a conversation there. And I wouldn't necessarily expect that the person reply, but that if you do get a response, you also want to be cordial and keep it very professional, and make sure that it seems like you're trying to build up your network, right? If you get too personal too quick, people get they get a bad feeling, and they might block you or cut you off, or maybe never respond. So you want to keep that very keep it related about that person and maybe the artwork, and keep it on a professional level. And that's how you start building up your network. Eventually, what happens if you continue a conversation thread, maybe over many months, right? Not just over a few days. So it's not like the guy responds immediately, you have to reply back, because it might seem like some crazy stalker, right? So having a conversation over a few months, and if it's going well, what you might do is connect with that person on LinkedIn, on another social media. What you might want to do is send them some of your work and ask them if they're going to give you a very quick response and say, can you give me your quickest critique in 5 minutes of my work, right? Or just a one sentence response. I would enjoy if you took one sentence and just replied back what you think I need to be working on, right? And that way, it's not a big ask, and you can keep that going. Eventually, if you build up this conversation, you might actually meet this person at an event or a trade show, and just remind them of who you are, and take it from there. A good handshake, and maybe you have a little gift for that person, like a drawing that you made for them. That kind of stuff is just a way to stay connected. You keep on. You keep in that person's mind, and then eventually, what that leads to is you want to have a connection that will lead to some kind of networking thing in the future, right? Um, cool. So I think on that note, we're going to end this, and I hope you guys are all enjoying your time as this coronavirus lockdown is happening. So most of us were all staying at home. So make sure you take advantage of what you're doing and being productive and staying on top of your skills, and maybe even doing some film research and watching some of the shows that we were mentioning before, so that you can take advantage of what's going on now. All right, guys, I'm gonna take this one, and then we're gonna continue these story chats. Hopefully, we'll have a time to do a couple more this week, and I'll get to your questions if I missed it later on. All right, friends, take care. We'll see you soon.